Of course, we are in the middle of a series at the moment called Follow. And in this series, what we've been trying to figure out is, what does it mean? What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus in these crazy times? And if you've missed part one and part two, part one, of course, was Do You Follow Me? Part two is called Where Do We Go Now? Both those messages are on our website, lighthousechurch.ie. Click on messages. And because this series is a kind of a sequential one, meaning each week builds off the other, it's really cool if you've missed last week's. It'd be really cool for you to go back and watch those and catch up as to where we are. But in terms of a quick recap for those of you who missed it, what we've essentially said is being a Christian is not something we're born into. It's not something we inherit. It's not something we're indoctrinated into. It's a choice that we make by faith in following Jesus. Really, Christianity is about following Jesus. And what we learned in week one and week two was, number one, being a sinner does not disqualify you from being a follower of Jesus. In fact, it's a prerequisite. We also learned, number two, that even being an unbeliever does not disqualify you from following Jesus, because many of the first believers in Jesus didn't really believe in him fully, didn't fully understand who he was, and yet he invited them to follow him. And number three, we learned that the invitation to follow Jesus is really an invitation to relationship. At the core of Christianity is not religion, but relationship. And so the bottom line is that in the Gospels, we see that Jesus has invited us. The bottom line is Jesus has invited you to follow. So the overarching question for the whole series is not, am I winning? Am I spiritual? Am I religious? Am I, qualified? The question is, am I following? Right now, present tense, am I following? Today, in part 3, this message is entitled, What are you afraid of? So do you follow me? Where do we go now? And today, what are you afraid of? And we're going to ask one very simple and specific question that we're going to spend the rest of our time answering today. And the question is simply this: if I follow Jesus, if you follow Jesus, if we follow Jesus, the question is, what is the end game? What is the payoff? I mean, what are we following Jesus for? I mean, we learned a little bit about last week of what we're following Jesus into and where, but what's the end game? Where is this thing going? What do we get at the end of all this? If I commit the rest of my life to following Jesus, then what is the payoff? Now, here's a couple of things it's not, and here's where again we're getting to our misconceptions of Jesus and Christianity. Number one, the first thing the end game is not is so that you could be a better person. Now, don't get me wrong, by following Jesus, you will become a better person. By following Jesus, you'll become kinder. You'll become more generous. You'll become more forgiving. Hopefully, you become more patient and tender-hearted and so on. You become more confident. Like, when we follow Jesus, we become like Jesus. And of course, Jesus wasn't just the greatest man to have ever lived person. He's also God in the flesh. So even though following Jesus does make us into better people, the goal, the end game, the purpose of following him isn't so that we become better people. Number two, the second thing following Jesus, the end goal is not, is so that we can go to heaven. Now again, good news. The reward for our faith in Jesus is that we one day spend eternity with him in heaven. It's why, despite all the uncertainty and all the fear of COVID, we as Christ followers do not need to be afraid. Why? Because death is not the end. Death is the reward. You cannot threaten a Christian with heaven. I mean, that's the reward. And even though heaven is a promise and heaven is real and we look forward to heaven, the end goal of our following him isn't just to get to heaven. You're thinking, well, that sounds a bit bizarre. Well, think about this. Think about, for example, when Jesus was being crucified. I mean, go to that part of the Gospels where we're being told about Jesus' crucifixion. And many of you remember that when Jesus was crucified, 2 criminals, 2 thieves, were crucified either side of him. And one of the thieves basically confessed to the fact that he believed Jesus was not deserving of death. He shouldn't be crucified. He was God, and that he, as the thief, was getting what he deserved. And in that moment, this crazy dialogue happens where basically Jesus says to this thief that even though you haven't followed me, even though you haven't believed in me, even though you haven't been a good person, because of this moment of faith on your, so to speak, deathbed, you will be with me for eternity. Meaning, and I don't know if you want to risk this, meaning we can live our lives however the heck we want, but if in a moment of faith we put our life in Jesus' hands, even at the end of our life on our deathbed, we get to go to heaven. God, in his mercy and grace, hears our sincere prayer and receives our faith. But you see, if that's what the gospel and following Jesus was about, well then we'd all just have to wait till our deathbed. But the point is following Jesus, the end goal, the end game. What's at stake, the payoff is about so much more than just becoming a good person and going to heaven. The third thing the end game is not so that we can have a pain or problem-free life, right? Now this is interesting because there's so many versions of Christianity out there that promote this healthy, wealthy lifestyle, that to follow God means you're going to be pain-free and problem-free, and if you have pain or have problems, it's not God's fault, it's because you have a lack of faith, right? And we see this time and time again on TV, and it's abusive, and it's coercive, and it's manipulative, and it's wrong, and it's not the gospel. Because when we read the gospel, when we read Jesus' own words, we see a different story. And so we think about what's the end goal for following him. It isn't that we'll have a pain-free, problem-free life, because anything in this world that promises you a pain-free or problem-free existence isn't the gospel. It isn't Christianity. It's magic. Anything that presents itself by virtue of a formula. Do A, B, C, this way, on this day, facing that way, holding this thing, saying this prayer, buy this thing, invest in this, anything that comes in a formula form and promises you pain-free or problem-free life is magic, okay? And the problem with magic is all magic works some of the time. I mean, all of us can get lucky. I mean, all of us can believe in weird things and sometimes it pays off. But the problem is for us as Christ followers, or those of you who are watching who are skeptics and considering today becoming a Christ follower, the problem is, faith in God is more than magic. And there is a difference between faith and superstition. A lot of times we see them intertwined, and it's hard to differentiate what's faith and what's superstition. God does not reward superstition. God rewards faith. Superstition is a version of faith mixed up with magic. And usually at the other end of superstition, someone's benefiting financially. Like you're going to pay for some service. Someone's going to pray for you. Someone's going to bless you. Someone's going to sell you something, a holy water, some kind of relic. I mean, there's someone's benefiting, someone's marketing, and someone's benefiting when it comes to superstition. But the gospel, when the gospel message does not require additional help. There's no accessories needed. It's as simple as putting our faith in Jesus. Now again, there's all sorts of examples of this. One of my favorite examples is St. Joseph. I have a photo here of St. Joseph. And this is St. Joseph the carpenter. Some of you may recognize him because the idea is that if you buy this €5, €6 miniature statue of St. Joseph the carpenter, right? And if you need to sell your house, well, some of you know this, if you need to sell your house, the idea is you go and you bury this little statue in your back garden. And when you bury him in your back garden and say these special prayers, the idea is God's going to hear your prayer, see, the relic in the ground. Some of the relic has some magical part in all this, and you're going to be able to sell your house. But don't forget, once you've sold the house, don't leave him in the garden, right? Because then you're going to be in trouble. You got to dig that guy back up again, right? And in fact, this is true. You can actually Google this, and there's actually a WikiHow article on how to buy and bury St. Joseph the carpenter in your house. Here's some photos, here's some examples. Don't forget to put him in the Ziploc bag. Very important. Don't dirty St. Joseph the carpenter. He won't be very happy, okay? He's had his bath, everybody. And if you're living in an apartment block and you don't have a garden, don't worry, because WikiHow's got you covered. All you need to do is buy yourself a potted plant, and you can put St. Joseph the carpenter in a Ziploc bag in your pot garden plant, and your place will sell today for a small price of $5.99. I mean, it's bizarre. It's bizarre. I mean, we don't know anything about St. Joseph the carpenter. All we know is that his He basically was Mary's husband, okay, and the kind of earthly father of Jesus in the sense that he took on the responsibility for raising him, and then he kind of disappears from the story. We don't know anything about him. For him to be venerated as a saint, and him to be, and his legacy to be reduced to being a small statue that someone sells to you so you can plant him in your garden, so you can stay your house, is bizarre. And the problem is our world is full of this nonsense, and it really is nonsense. And even if some of you have done that, or you know someone who has, God honors the prayer and the faith, okay, not the relic and the magic. God doesn't need help, people. Our prayers don't need accessories. The gospel doesn't need add-ons. What we're talking about here is a faith in Jesus. And anything that promises you in a solution form, a way, a format to get away, a formula to get away from pain and problems, is not faith. It's magic. Now, don't get me wrong. Again, don't get me wrong. I want to say this clearly. Following Jesus will help you avoid some pain and problems in life. But at the same time, following Jesus will also create some new pains and problems in life. So therefore, what we can see is the end game for following Jesus isn't that we become a good person only, isn't that one day we go to heaven only, and isn't that we live a pain-free, problem-free life. Even Jesus himself said to his disciples in John's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 33, in this world you will have trouble. That's a promise. In this world you will have trouble. So the question is then, well, if these three things aren't the end game, if they aren't what it's all about, so what is? I mean, what is the payoff? What's the payoff for following Jesus? What we're going to do is we're going to turn together to one gospel account, one gospel story, kind of an obscure one, but it really illustrates this point perfectly. It's found in the Gospel of Matthew, okay, the first gospel, chapter 10. And I want to encourage you, if you have time later on, read all the way from verse 1 to verse 31. We're going to hone in on verse 16, but Matthew 1 to verse 31. It's an incredible story we're going to dive into. We're going to pick it up in verse 16. And again, if you want to track along with me in today's notes, all of my notes are in the Bible app by YouVersion. Simply download the app by YouVersion, click on More, click on Events, find your location, Lighthouse Church Navan, Lighthouse Church Dublin, and all of today's notes will be there for you. Now, let me give you some background to what's happening. So if you were to read verse 1 to verse 16, what we find is Jesus is in the process of calling his disciples. If you were with us last week, you remember how he was walking along the lake and he sees Simon Peter and his brother Andrew and James and John, sons of Zebedee, and this amazing miracle happens with the catch of fish. And essentially he invites them to follow him, okay? Well, this is kind of continuing now where he has all of the disciples, or you may know them as apostles, and it gives a full list of who they are. And he kind of begins to instruct them as to what they're going to be doing for the next while. So he kind of tells them, look, you're going to do what I did. You're going to go out to these villages, proclaim the good news. You're going to heal sick people. Here's what I do in this scenario. Here's what to do in the other scenario. And at the end of this kind of dialogue, this instruction, this kind of preparing them, he kind of reveals to them the true nature of the struggle, but through that then, the ultimate end game of what this following is all about. Let's pick up in verse 16 where Jesus said this, I am sending you out like sheep amongst the wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Now again, this is, you can imagine again, let's put ourselves in the story. The disciples are listening to Jesus. That sounds a bit heavy, right? That's more than a happy clappy Christianity right there, because I mean sheep and wolves don't usually go together. You know what I'm saying? Like usually when there's sheep and wolves, the wolves will win every time. When was the last time you ever saw a sheep chasing down a wolf or a dog or a rabbit or anything that wasn't grass? I mean, sheep are extremely vulnerable animals. So it's an interesting choice of words that you use here, Jesus, when you say you're sending us out like sheep among the wolves. That's pretty heavy. And then, of course, the next line is like this almost contradicts in terms. I want you to be like shrewd as snakes, but innocent as doves. I mean, what does that even mean? It's almost like he's saying, like, I want you to be able to operate in the world like a snake would, like just being crafty and being clued into the reality of how things work. But I want your motive always to be pure and your heart always to be full of innocence. So at this point in the kind of instruction talk. The disciples are going, that's quite interesting. Then in verse 17, he goes even further and says, be on your guard, right? Of course, because we're going to be sheep among wolves. We're going to be vipers, snakes amongst the world. Like, okay, be on your guard. For you will be handed over, he says, to the local councils and will be flogged in their synagogues. And of course, this is the point where disciples go, whoa, time out. What I mean, like, hey, we got thousands of people following us, Jesus. People want to talk to you. They want to be near you. You're teaching them. You're changing their life. People are being healed. This is awesome. It's wonderful. Everyone loves us. How could we ever get to a point where things get so bad that A, we're going to be arrested, handed over to the council. Local council means arrested, and flogged. That sounds so severe. And of course, in a way, when you read on in the Gospels and definitely the book of Acts, Jesus is predicting exactly what's about to happen. Now, flogging, of course, was a terrible, terrible thing. Flogging was a brutal public beating that, some people actually didn't survive from. They died as a result of flogging. But not only was flogging a physical beating that caused you great pain and scarred you for life, flogging was also like a mark, a cultural mark. Like, for example, in Ireland, when you're driving and you do something wrong, you get penalty points, right? And there's usually penalty points, sometimes there's a fine, and there's a period of time, right, where those penalty points stay on your license. The idea, of course, being if you get too many penalty points in a period of time, you lose the right to drive in this country because you're a dangerous driver. Well, this was like penalty points that never went away, right? Because on your body you carry the scars of not just being beaten up, but as in you're a criminal, you've broken the law, you're bad. And so not only was flogging a terrible physical experience, but culturally, it made people outcasts. It put them outside the group. It put them outside the normal confines of family, our society. Now, I don't know what the disciples are thinking, but I imagine they're thinking, you know what? Jesus loves teaching in metaphors, right? He's always telling these parables. Surely, right, the sheep and wolves part, surely the being arrested and flogged part, surely these are all just pretty heavy metaphors, right? They're thinking this is just a pretty heavy metaphor. But again, Jesus continues in verse 18. He clarifies even further. He says, on my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. Again, if you go forward and read the book of Acts, all this happened. We know Peter and John stood before the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish council. Later on, the Apostle Paul will get saved. We learned about him a few weeks ago in Stranger Times series. And of course, God specifically separated him to be a witness to the Gentiles. He stands before King Agrippa at the end of Acts. Like, everything Jesus is saying right now makes absolutely no sense to this bunch of men and women who've just decided to follow him. A few minutes ago, they're fishing. A few minutes ago, they're tax collectors. And all of a sudden, Jesus is predicting the cost of what's involved in following him. In verse 19 says, but when they arrest you, I love this, but when they arrest, guys, don't worry, okay, listen, sheep amongst wolves, vipers, doves, flogged, arrested, councils, but when they arrest you, do not worry, right? Do not worry about what, Jesus? Do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. Now, I'm thinking, what do you mean don't be worried what to say? If I'm arrested and I'm flogged, I'm not worried about what to say or how to say it. I'm worried about being arrested and flogged. I don't need help in what to say, how to say it. I need help to not be arrested. I need help to not be flogged. I need help to not be in this position of persecution. I need help to be set free. And I can imagine the disciples were thinking, what to say? My goodness, we don't need what to say. We need to get out of jail, Jesus. We don't need words. We don't need a script. We don't need notes. We need a get out of jail free card. If this is no longer a metaphor, if this is literally going to happen to us, then we literally want you to do something about it. But Jesus continues in verse 20, for it will be not you speaking, he said, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And of course, this is a moment of great tension. Don't miss it. Because these disciples are going, hang on, we just seen you perform these incredible miracles, right? The miracle of the great catch we saw last week, and you invite us to follow you. And we've bought into this because we think you're amazing. And we don't know fully what we know, but we know that you know more than we know, and so we were willing to trust you on this journey. But now you're telling us that part of what's at stake here is that we're going to suffer and be arrested and flogged and all these things. And then Jesus says, But don't worry, because the Spirit of your Father, your heavenly Father who loves you, God is with you. And I can imagine the disciples feeling this tension of kind of going, well, maybe thinking, maybe even saying, well, if God is going to be with us, then question Jesus, question teacher. If God's going to be with us, then why does God not stop us? Why doesn't God not intervene? Why doesn't God not prevent us from being arrested, flogged, hated, and persecuted? Why doesn't God stop all these bad things, right, from happening to good people? We think this, don't we, all the time? Why doesn't God intervene? Jesus continues, verse 21, he says, brother will betray brother to death, and the father his child, and children rebel against their parents, have them put to death. Again, all this happened as he wrote forth the clock when the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. There was rewards and incentives for people to denounce, and to kind of like in communist countries, historically speaking, where family members would be incentivized to snitch on their family and have them arrested because they didn't believe what they're supposed to believe. And so many Christians were sentenced to death because a brother, a father, a mother, a sister, a child denounced them. So this is, again, Jesus predicting exactly what happened before it ever happened. In verse 22, you will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Now, let's just take a pause here for a second, because, again, let's try our best to put ourselves in the shoes of these first disciples. We're endeavoring to follow Jesus today. Imagine what those first followers were thinking. Imagine Peter thinking, hang on a second, you told me I was going to catch some fish, and I saw the net break, and I saw, the boats full, and I saw this, it was so full of, fun and joy and amazing. Jesus, you didn't tell us about this side of it. You didn't tell us that it was going to be this difficult. You didn't tell us the full truth. It's almost like you didn't tell us this. For most of us, we're thinking becoming a Christian means sacrificing a lion. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have to get out of bed early on Sunday. Oh my gosh, what a price to pay. But for these first disciples, it was so much more, because these were real things. Jesus isn't speaking metaphorically here. He's speaking literally. And the idea that many of those first disciples would actually suffer, and most of them would actually have to give their lives for this message. Can you imagine the shock? Talk about trying to lose your followers. Talk about how to, scare people away. But it was the truth. Now we're kind of asking ourselves today, well, what has that got to do with the question we're trying to answer today? What is the end game in terms of our following? What is the end game in terms of the payoff of our faith? Well, skip down now to verse 28 then. Again, you can read it later on, but verse 28, Jesus then says this in conclusion. He says, but don't worry, guys. Don't worry. And he doesn't say because this is metaphor, or because I'm going to free from us. He says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Yeah, you're going to be hated. Yeah, you're going to be imprisoned. Yeah, you're going to be beaten. But listen, do not be afraid. And then again, maybe the disciples are getting a bit of hope in their heart. Maybe there's a twist in this plot. Maybe there's something we're missing. But Jesus continues, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. So they're going, hang on, that's not exactly good news. We shouldn't be afraid, not because these things won't happen to us, but we shouldn't be afraid because even though these people who hate us and persecute us and arrest us and beat us, they can kill our body, but the positive thing is they can't kill our soul. Then Jesus in verse 29 kind of continues and says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? The inference here being, are not birds really cheap? In the first century, birds were really cheap commodities. You could buy 2 sparrows for a penny. And again, they would have all understood this reference and gotten it. And Jesus says, yet not one of these, what man deems, expendable, inexpensive animals, not one of them falls to the ground outside your Father's care. Verse 30, and even the very hairs on your heads are numbered. So, in conclusion, verse 31, do not be afraid, for you are worth more than many sparrows. So what's the point? What Jesus is saying is that even though these challenges happen, don't be afraid, because what happens in the world can only affect our body, but what happens after the world can affect our soul. In essence, what he's saying is the nature of God is that he cares for us and that he takes notice of things the world deems not worth noticing. I mean, he takes notice of things that are inexpensive or unworthy or are dispensable. God cares about sparrows. In fact, God cares about you so much that the very hairs on your head are numbered. Now, some of you are thinking, that's not very impressive because I have no hair on my head. I mean, I can count them myself. But the point is that God pays attention to the detail in our lives when it comes to how God feels about us. Here's the crucial point today. When it comes to how God feels about us, just because we go through difficult times doesn't mean, it isn't an indication or a message that somehow God doesn't care or God isn't with us, because we're told we have worth. Listen to me, friend. Maybe your spouse, your ex-girlfriend, maybe your teacher, maybe the world has told you have no worth, you have no value. I want you to know from the words of Jesus himself, he says in God's eyes, in the Father's eyes, you have worth, you have value, you matter. And even though you may feel like no one's noticing the details, what's going on and the pain you're going through, God knows even the very numbers of hair on your head. God is involved. God is interested. God cares for you. But again, there's a tension here, right? Because we're thinking, well, if God cares for us, then why the flogging and why the arresting and why the hatred and why the persecution? This is really important. Why? Because Jesus is telling his disciples, bad things are going to happen to you because of me. But the point is, when they happen, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid when they do. You see, this is so important. The message of Jesus is not, clearly, the message of Jesus is not, don't be afraid. I won't let bad things happen to you. Isn't that what we say to our kids all the time? I won't let bad things happen to you. Isn't that what we see played out in movies time and time again? I promise I'll protect you. Whether it's a Captain America or a Batman or some superhero, I won't let bad things happen to you. And inevitably what happens is, well, that person usually dies or gets beaten up or something bad happens to them. Why? Because even Hollywood knows that we as human beings cannot fulfill the promise to not allow bad things to happen to those that we love. It's a part of life. And anyone that comes along and tries to push a book, a formula, a prayer, a statue, some weird magical thing that guarantees you a pain-free, problem-free life, existence, or Christianity, that's not the gospel. That's superstition, friend. That's magic. Jesus did not say, don't worry, disciples, I will not let any bad happen to you. The message of Jesus is, however, when bad things happen to you, you don't have to be afraid. Very different. When bad things happen to you, you don't have to be afraid. What is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying the end game is not becoming a better person. The end game is not going to heaven alone. The end game is not that you have a pain-free, problem-free life. The end game, my friend, is that you would realize how much your Father in heaven loves you. That you realize how interested he is in the detail of your story and how present he is in your suffering, and that you would be able to see and receive his care. And what would happen is faith would rise in your heart. The end game that Jesus is trying to push his disciples toward is that if you follow me, you will have faith. And faith is a confidence. Faith is a confidence in the person of God. Faith is a confidence that God is who he says he is, and God will do what he says he will do, that God is able and God is faithful to do what God said and promised he would do, that God is willing. Faith is confidence. And in a world that is so broken and so twisted and so backwards, and even though we try so hard at a superficial level to act like we're keeping it all together, we know deep down in our hearts, come on, remember the first verse, we're broken and we need help, right? Even though we're broken, need help. This faith, this confidence rises within us and helps us in the face of fear, in the face of beatings, in the face of persecutions, in the face of being arrested. And of course, many of these things we will never experience, thank God, because we live in a free country, that saves us from this kind of persecution. But we may feel a different kind of persecution, the rejection of family and friends because of our faith. We may go through things. We may have to sacrifice things. Maybe it's in work and you're up in line for promotion, but you don't compromise being at church on Sunday, so you forego the promotion, choosing instead to honor God with your Sunday, and therefore you're persecuted. Maybe it's in a relationship. You know you shouldn't be with the person you're with because they don't share the same worldview, they don't share the same love for God, and you know it's going to affect your relationship sooner or later, and it's definitely going to affect your parenting when it comes time to have children. And you go, man, even though it's good and easy and nice for me to have all my needs met by a person who does not have the same faith for me, I want to honor God in my relations. Maybe it's financially, right? Maybe you're kind of just trying to justify why you're not honoring God with your tithe or being generous, and you get to this point where it's like, I would rather suffer, I would rather have less and honor God. Right, like King David prayed, I won't build a temple for myself while the tabernacle is in a tent. You get this point of revelation where faith rises in your hands. I'm going to trust God anyway. I'm going to trust God no matter what the cost. I mean, if I have to sit here tomorrow and not have a meal, at least I know in my heart I have confidence in God. Whatever it may be, we may find ourselves struggling and suffering because of our faith. But here's the message that Jesus wants us to hear. Here's the kind of payoff. Here's the end game for a lifetime of following him. The payoff is this, the end game is this, that as a result of following Jesus, we would have a faith, not a faith in the absence of fear, not a faith that replaces fear, not a faith that pretends fear is not there, not even a faith that needs some hocus pocus magic voodoo nonsense, right, to make us feel better. The end game for following Jesus is that we would have a faith that overcomes fear. A faith that is bigger, a faith that is stronger, a faith that has real power, that enables us and empowers us to overcome fear. A faith that drives out fear, that chases it away, that when fear comes along, our faith rises like a big dog, and the back of our faith sends that fear running. The fear is still there. The fear is still real. The challenges of our life and of our existence are still real. But the promise, the end game, the end goal of following Jesus is that as we grow more to love him and be like him, we will have a faith and confidence in our hearts that the world cannot shatter. Sin cannot destroy. Death cannot destroy. Suffering, sickness, illness, heartache, heartbreak, whatever may come, whatever may happen to us on our earthly bodies, the end game for following Jesus is that we have a faith that overcomes. Now, let's be honest. Come on, if you're with me, you admit, I want that faith. We know people like that, don't we, who just in the face of unprecedented opposition somehow have this ability to trust and believe and are confident in God, and we want that too, and you can have that too. You don't need to be a saint, whoever, to have that kind of faith. All that is required is that we follow Jesus. Now again, this is fascinating to me that this is kind of what, when you read the Gospels, you see it time and time and time again. This idea that Jesus is trying to get the disciples to see through the eyes of faith and overcome fear. Let me give you two famous examples. The first one is a Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel 6 and verse 30 to 32. Many have heard this before. Jesus asks, you of little faith. So here we go, the faith connection. He says, so do not worry, saying, and here's what we worry about in the Western world, what shall I eat? So who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to pay the groceries? Or what shall we drink? Right? Who's going to keep us alive? Who's going to kind of supply the provisions we need to exist? And number 3, what shall we wear? Jesus is saying, don't allow these things to drive your life. And you say, well, they don't. I'm not that worried about my bills. I'm not worried about my mortgage. I'm not that worried about how people think of me or see me or how I come across on social media. You can tell yourself that and deceive yourself, but the truth is, most of what we do and most of why we do it is driven from a fear. Look at this pandemic we've been in, this lockdown, and look at how people are making decisions because they're afraid. And people make strange decisions when they're afraid. And we're afraid that, what if I can't pay my mortgage? And what if I can't, buy that thing? What if people don't like me? Or if they don't accept me? And Jesus saying, listen, if you're going to be my follower, don't be like everyone else. Verse 32, the pagans, the non-believers, they run after these things. But your heavenly Father knows that you need them. And again, if you read that portion in context, Jesus also talks about sparrows. So it's the same kind of thing. But essentially it's the same vein. Jesus saying, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid of these things? God knows you need them. Just trust him. Have confidence in God's ability to take care of you. That's what following means. A second example, I think this is a really funny one. It wasn't funny for disciples, but it's funny for us looking back, is of course in Mark's Gospel, chapter 4 and verse 40, the storm on the Sea of Galilee. So the Sermon on the Mount, number one, first example. Second example, the storm on the Sea of Galilee. And again, if you read the story in context, Jesus is basically in the boat. You know this. He's sleeping. The storm kind of comes up on the Sea of Galilee, and the waves are crashing, the wind is blowing. We know some of the guys are fishermen, so they're kind of pretty experienced, which is why it's so significant that when the ones who are fishermen who fished on Galilee their whole lives started to freak out, you knew it was a real crisis, right? I mean, when you're with someone who knows something and they're freaking out, now you're in trouble, right? Recently I had to go to hospital with my son, and he hurt himself playing sport, and we're in seeing the doctor, and doctors do a really good job of maintaining calm and everything. But when the doctor starts to get worried, right, you know this as a parent, when the doctor starts to get worried, then you start getting worried. And so for these disciples, I mean, the ones who weren't fishermen, who probably couldn't swim, they're thinking, well, we're okay as long as the guys who know what they're doing are okay. But when they start freaking out, now we're all freaking out. So everyone's freaking out because maybe four of them could swim, the other couldn't. The storm's really bad, and of course Jesus is sleeping in the boat, and the disciples are kind of indignant. Like, how can Jesus, number one, how can he be so not with this? How is he not threatened by what's going on around us, right? And number two, why doesn't he care? And so they wake him up, and Jesus kind of commands the storm to stop. And in verse 40 he says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" You see, it's like Jesus is showing us that the end game for the following, the thing that Jesus was trying to get into these early disciples, was this idea that you don't have to be afraid because we have faith. Now they're asking, why the storm? Why the wind? Why the danger? Why are you asleep? Why are you not with us? Why didn't you do more? Why didn't you less? They're asking why less, and Jesus is asking them, why are you afraid? They're asking why the storm, and we do this all the time. We say, why the difficulty, God? Why the suffering? Why the pain? Why not this? Why not that? And God is responding by asking us, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And it's so interesting because we're told that after Jesus calmed the storm, I mean, they were afraid of the storm, right? But when they watched Jesus speak to the elements and watched them obey his voice, we're told they were terrified. And in the Greek language, it says they feared a great fear. Like the fear of Jesus was so much more significant than the fear of the storm. And in that is the point. That is exactly the point that I want us to see. That we should fear the power and reality and awesomeness of God, and not the temporality of the seasons and the storms around us, because the disciples missed the point that even though the sea was raging and the storm was crashing and the wind was howling, that in that boat was the very anchor of their soul. They were safer in that boat, in the eye of that storm, and they were on solid and dry ground. That what they should be afraid of is not what the storm can do, but they should be afraid of what one word from the mouth of our Lord and Savior can do. Jesus asked them, why are you so afraid? And again, we don't need to feel guilty or beaten up, because these guys, it took 3.5 years for most of these guys to get it, okay? So it takes a while. But the question we gotta ask ourselves is if the end game is that Jesus wants us in our following of him to develop a faith. He doesn't want us to develop fear. He wants to develop a faith that overcomes fear. Then a question we should ask is, well, why is this the payoff? Why is this? Why this the end game? Why not heaven? Why not be a good person? Why not pain-free, problem-free? I got three big ideas. 3 big ideas for why I think faith that overcomes fear is the payoff. Here we go. Number 1. The first one is this. An overcoming faith, we're told, honors God. The first reason why I believe faith overcoming fear is the end game of our following is because, let's be honest, when we live our lives in this world with a faith that overcomes fear, it honors God, right? I mean, some of you are parents and you know this awesome privilege we have when our kids trust us, right? When they just trust us. It's like they're standing on a wall or some high place and you say, just jump. And everything in their mind saying, this is not a good idea. I don't like this. I don't want to do this. It's safer to be on the wall. It's safer to be on the ground. But something in them in that moment realizes, no, the safest place to be is my Father's arms. And so despite all logic and rationale in their little minds, they jump fully trusting in the voice of their Father and his capacity to catch them. And as a father, right, or as a mother, as a parent, you kind of experience is this sense of, wow, like this person really trusts me, right? They really, really trust me. It honors them. Or when, if your kids are older, like I have a teenager now, and when you get to that age, it's a bit different because if you jump off walls, you probably wouldn't catch them, they'd probably flatten you. But it changes, right? Same thing, but it changes because maybe now it's advice. I want you to, I wouldn't do that, son or daughter. I would do this way. And there's nothing more complimentary or honoring to a parent than a teenager who, rather than doing the easy thing that all teenagers do and go, my parents know nothing. I mean, they were born 1,000 years ago. They listen to the wisdom of their parents. And when they put that wisdom in action, nothing blesses us more, is that right, as parents, to see our teenagers step out in faith, trusting our voice. I believe a faith that overcomes fear honors God. A faith that says, I'm willing to forgo promotion to serve and be at church. I'm willing to suffer financially to honor God with my tithe. I'm willing to give up that night with my pals because I'm going to be connected in a connect group. I'm going to give up popularity because I'm not going to be quiet with my faith. My faith is not private. It's personal, but it's not private. Faith is a public thing. I believe that when we step out with that kind of God-honoring faith, it blesses the heart of God. The second big idea is this: an overcoming faith liberates us from fear. An overcoming faith liberates us from fear. We don't have to be fearful. The world is so afraid of everything. Why? Because deep in the conscience, deep in the psyche of those who do not follow Jesus or believe in God, there is this truth that the people suppress and don't want to confront. And the truth is that all we have in this life is this. And when this life is taken away, it's all over. And people are terrified losing their position, their status, their wealth, their power, their place in the world. They're terrified of death. But as Christ followers, we don't have to be captives to fear, because the faith that we have, the confidence that we have in God, liberates us from fear. So we see it and we recognize it, but we don't have to be controlled by it. We don't have to submit to it. We don't have to give in to it, because every time faith comes with the big voice of, oh, you're going to lose, lack, miss, all these things fear says, the voice of faith, like the roar of a lion, comes out and speaks to that fear and sends it running away. And overcoming faith not only honors God, but liberates us from fear. Come on, isn't that what you want today? That's what I want. I want to live this life. I want to live in this world with a real active confidence in God that liberates me from all my fears. The third big idea is this: an overcoming faith. And this is perhaps why, I think in part, or at least largely, why this is the end game. Because an overcoming faith not only honors God and liberates us from fear, but overcoming faith leads us to love. It's only when we have this overcoming faith that we can love the world, because we're not afraid. We're not closed up. I mean, we've all been hurt and we've all been betrayed. We've all experienced various levels of abuse in our lives, whether it's emotional or physical, whatever it is. And so we become afraid to love, we become afraid to be generous, we become afraid to be kind, we become afraid to be generous because we're constantly thinking, what will it cost me? But when you have the love of God in our lives, when we have a faith that overcomes fear, that overcoming faith makes real love possible. I believe it's why in 1 John 4:18, John says this: there is no fear in love, but like a roaring lion, perfect love drives out fear. I love that language. Doesn't suppress it, ignore it, hide it. Perfect love drives it out. It says, you've got no place here. I don't listen to your voice. I don't believe in your reality. I believe in something else. My confidence is not found in the things of this world, but my confidence is found in my Father in heaven. And he says, I have worth, and I have value, and I have purpose, and he knows my details. And even though his message is not, come to me and I'll save you from pain and suffering, his promise is, I will be with you in it, and you do not have to be afraid. So the question was, What is the end game for following Jesus? Well, it's not so we can be a better person. It's not just so we can go to heaven. And it's not so we can have a pain-free, problem-free life. Following Jesus means we develop a faith that overcomes fear. A faith that drives the fear out of our lives. A confidence in God that reshapes and reframes how we interact with this world. Jesus in John 16:33 says, I've quoted this at the beginning, I have told you these things that you may have peace. In this world, he said, you will have trouble. Right there in the gospel, Jesus' words. But take heart, for I have overcome the world. And if your faith is in me and your confidence is with me, I will walk with you through anything. Being a follower of Jesus, friends, means that we have a faith that overcomes all fear. Join me next week in part 4 as we ask the question, what's the cost? God bless you guys.